Welcome. Today we are going to discuss a topic which is avoided at best and tragically misunderstood at worst. Fortunately, we have one of the foremost authors in the United States with us today, Cecil Murphy, and then also Sue Cameron, who is also authoring a book on the topic. Welcome, and thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, you flew in all the way from New York, and it's a privilege?
Atlanta.
Atlanta. Oh, okay, good. Well, Atlanta, New York, it's a long way from El Paso,
It is,
that's for sure.
right.
So, Cece, you know, you have written over 125 different books, and you've written some of the biggest bestsellers out there, 90 Minutes in Heaven, the Ben Carson story.
Gifted Hands.
And then one that I didn't even realize that you'd ghostwritten this, which was Franklin Graham's autobiography.
That's
right?
correct.
Yeah, that was one of my very favorite books. I loved it. You're a great writer. So why, in the midst of all of this wonderful stuff that you're writing about and all these marvelous people that you're dealing with, have you delved into this topic, which your book that you have right here, which is When a Man You Love is Abused? Why all of a sudden get into this whole seedy, surly, awful topic of sexual abuse?
Well, because it's something we need to talk about. And it happened to me, happened to Sue, happens to a lot of people.
Right.
Officially for males it's 1 in 6, but probably more realistically it's about the same as females, 1 in 3. Basically what I did is I began to become aware of my childhood abuse. Memories started just kind of pouring out of me, and I had to deal with it. And after I dealt with it for several years, I decided to write a couple of articles. If I'm not sure if a topic will sell, I usually write an article or two, and they both did very, very well.
Went viral,
so I wrote the book, and nobody wanted to buy it. It took me 6 years to sell the book.
That's interesting. Now,
And by the way, and I sell just about everything I write.
right, yeah, of course. And so why you say that you just realized or kind of came to grips with, you're not a spring chicken when it comes to having lived life, but you actually came to this realization fairly late in life, is that?
I was 51 years old. I'm a runner. And I usually run like 6 miles a day. And
Right.
this particular morning, I took a long run, and I ran 13 miles. And on the way back, I started crying. I had not cried since I was 11 years old.
Wow.
My dad used to beat me a lot, and I determined he'd never see me cry again. And so, you know, you shut off, and you shut off all your emotions, or most of them. And as I started running, got about a mile from home, and I started crying. I mean, convulsively crying. And then the memories just started pouring out. See, I'd never been to a therapist because, see, one of the problems we have is trust. I would never have trusted somebody I had to pay for, you know.
Yes.
But that's how it began. And then I eventually told my family of origin, and they confirmed a lot of the stuff that was coming back to me. Because I didn't want to believe it.
Right. Now, so this is fairly typical that someone would not have memory of this, or that the memories would come back?
Weren't you, talk about women first.
Yeah.
Actually, I don't know about typical or not, but if you have big blocks of childhood or of your life that you don't remember anything, that can be a clue that something very traumatic happened. And I personally believe it's God's provision to protect the young so that they could survive in life.
Good
But
point.
it seems like for women, typically, if you have not dealt with have not dealt with and been healed from your sexual abuse, about the age of 40, start having symptoms, very troubling, and they can range from depression. It isn't always connected to sexual abuse, but the clues could be eating disorders, uncontrolled rage, unexplained chronic pains and illness, sleeplessness, sexual dysfunction. There's a big list.
Similar with men.
Right.
Men tend to be a little bit older when it starts coming up closer to 50, and at least in the people I've dealt with, but it doesn't matter. I think a couple of things happen. One, I think you have enough inner security, it becomes safe to talk about it.
Yeah. Now, well, you talk about shattering the silence. So, so silence around this issue is a huge problem, particularly for male sexual abuse, but also for female abuse. Is that
And
right?
I think in the church, we have a real stigma also about talking about sexual things in general. And I just think of the Good Samaritan, and I think that we sort of are like that priest who sees that something's bad and hurtful, and we kind of want to look the other way and walk by instead of dealing with it.
And I think one of the issues with males is that we've got this societal image that we should never be molested because we're strong. And I even today I find men who blame themselves because they were molested at 6 years old. I should have fought him off. I mean, how is a kid 6 years old going to fight off somebody 25?
Yeah, yeah. Now, the other thing that you said has evolved is the whole definition of sexual abuse. Can you define that for us? Explain to us what is meant by sexual abuse these days.
Well, I would say it's a little bit different than Cease's definition, but I would say it's when another person uses you for their sexual or emotional, to have their sexual or emotional needs met without your permission or without any kind of relationship, where you're being actually used as someone would use a bottle of wine or some other object to satisfy themselves.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is that the person becomes an object
Yes.
rather than a real person in reality, because their needs are not important. It's the needs of the abuser.
The perpetrator.
Are abusers and perpetrators usually, dirty old men or evil women, or are they
They're everything.
the person next door?
Everywhere. You know, generally, for men, and probably true for women, the abusers are not people hiding out in the park. These are somebody within your realm who you should be able to trust.
Which is what makes it so tragic.
Well, of course, the big things now with the Catholic Church, and not just Catholic churches, the Protestant Church is beginning to open up with their abusive stories too. But these are people in positions of trust, and they are the people who should be able to protect us.
And for women, at least, I know that the vast majority of sexual abuse happens within families. Either really fathers, sadly, or grandfathers are the most common perpetrators, or older brothers. If there's more than, I think it's 3 or 5 years, they consider it not to be child play, but to be sexual abuse. Within families, or uncles, or aunts, or mothers, I mean, this is something that's coming out too, is that there are females that are perpetrators, which some people think, how could that be true? But it is true, sadly. So.
Well, is abuse something that is kind of a modern invention, or has it been around for a long time?
Forever. There's references to it in the Old Testament. I lived in Africa in the 60s, and I heard, not many, but I heard a few stories even in the 60s, but it's been around forever. Look, as long as you've got sin in the world, you're always going to have some form of perversion.
Right.
That's right.
And it's only recently, in recent years, we've been able to talk about it. I mean, 30 years ago, no woman ever talked about being sexually assaulted as a child. We just didn't talk that way. And now they've given us males the courage to say what they were saying 30 years ago.
Is sexual abuse something that the psychological community treats differently than other types of conditions, or is it something that people will deal with?
I don't actually know what the psychological, but I know that the survivors treat it differently.
Yeah.
There's so much shame often, or guilt, or confusion over it, that bringing it forward is very, very difficult. A lot of times, that very first step. Would you agree?
Oh,
to that?
yeah, I think those very first steps, it's shame, guilt, those are the two big, and see, those, I can only speak for men, we feel a lot of shame. And you see, here's what you have to understand about the male psyche, is that if I tell you I've been abused, that the implication is something is wrong with me. See, it's like I did something bad instead of saying something bad was done to me. And that makes it so difficult.
And very often, to even complicate it, is the perpetrator plays on that emotion.
yeah.
I know one survivor whose father said every time he abused this one survivor, he would say to her, "Don't ever let me do that to you again." So it put the total responsibility, at least to the child. That's how, and she grew up with the sense that somehow she had caused this to happen because it was repeated.
Or I know a fellow who, perpetrators used to say to him, "You're so cute. If you weren't so cute, so good looking, I wouldn't molest you." Well, that's nonsense.
Yeah.
Right, right.
It somehow, and particularly for children, when you have a situation where people are supposed to be trusted, protecting that child, and then they'll believe anything they say,
Absolutely.
you know,
Absolutely.
and internalize that. So how are people affected by abuse? Are men and women affected differently?
Perhaps, but I think there's so many common factors: lack of trust, shame, guilt, lack of self-worth. We could go on down the list, can't
And
we?
at least I would say sexual dysfunction. One of my big concerns is the way marriages are affected. Because in my own story, it wasn't until I married, and with great excitement, I might add, and joy about coming into an intimate relationship with my husband, and discovered these flashbacks in the middle of intimate moments and my body shutting down. And I was just so enraged that my perpetrator could not have only hurt me all those many years ago, but that he was hurting my marriage, which was hurting my husband.
Yeah.
And my husband is such a good, loving, kind, gentle man. That is when I finally decided I needed to get healing.
Yeah, my story isn't all that different because I had no awareness of it. I was married in my early 20s, and we had a very good sex life, except a couple of times my wife would come to me. I mean, I'd go to bed, and I wouldn't expect her to do anything, and she'd reach over and touch me, and I'd freak out. I'd just freeze. But as long as I expected it, or particularly if I initiated, because see, control is another issue. I love to control. And one of the things I've had to learn is just to say, it's okay, I'm letting go. But if she touched me and I wasn't expecting it, I jumped, froze, and then she'd say, "What's wrong?" And I would never know how to answer. I'd say, "Oh, I guess I'm just tired." And I remember one time I was lying there saying, "God, what's wrong with me?" And I could hear her crying. Later on, she said to me, I was lying there saying, "God, what did I do wrong?"
Yeah.
So it does affect your spouse.
And how can spouses begin to maybe be aware that this has happened? Because certainly, if what you're saying is true, women may not come to a full understanding until their 40s, men till their 50s. That's a lot of time to be married and intimate with this being lurking in the background. How do you deal with that? What's your recommendation there?
Well, let's talk about it. Here's one thing I want to say to your mate. Your mate can be your spouse or it can be a therapist, but it's impossible to be both. That is, if they're there to try to heal you, forget it. But if they're there to love you, to listen, to be open to you, I think you can do something. And that's, and see, my wife didn't understand it. My wife got this wonderful background. I call her a cradle Christian. She doesn't know what it's like not to be a believer, and I'm an adult convert. But, she listened, and she said to me one time, "I don't understand this, but I love you and I'm with you."
Yeah. So that was a big part of it, even though things may be happening that you can't explain, like, responding poorly to touch or whatever, to still have that loving, open relationship and wait and see what the Holy Spirit reveals, possibly.
And I'd say for my own personal journey is that I actually found my healing path among women friends and prayer and study of the scripture to try to figure out, well, if sex is supposed to be good, this wasn't good, and really starting very early on to try to understand God's pattern and how does it get perverted and all of that. So I think that I didn't actually enlist my husband's help in the journey, but the fact that he was committed to me and faithful and always kind and slow and
Respectful,
tender
yeah.
and respectful of who and how I was reacting without needing to understand it. And he knew I'd been abused, but never knew the details of it because
Sure.
it didn't seem. It seemed like something so long ago. I was only 10, you know, and it didn't seem like it was going to affect us.
Right.
And that's, like I said, that was what was most startling to me, is that it did affect us.
So from a pastoral counseling perspective or a premarital counseling perspective, this would actually be an important topic to explore, perhaps?
Sure,
would you
but
say
you
so?
know, you have to remember, Holly, there's got to be a certain amount of trust even to do that.
Right.
So we all have to find our entry points. With me, I could never have done that. My best friend, he's been my best friend for 31 years, and he was available to me. My best friend and my wife. If it hadn't been for those two people, I never would probably have opened up. But I think there's also this sense, I think I finally realized that I was lovable. I think that's one of the things healing, is when you realize that you're
How
lovable.
were you feeling before?
Oh, intellectually, I knew all the scriptures. God so loved the world, so and intellectually, I give you. I'm quite orthodox, by the way. But emotionally, here's the way I felt. I felt that God so loved the world. That's a package deal, and I sneaked in.
You got snuck in under
But it
the
wasn't because
wire.
God specifically loved me. Just
Right.
got
That's
stuck
a
with
good-
me
That's good.
Yeah.
because I felt so unworthy.
That
I think-
unworthiness. Shame.
Yeah, and you know, if you don't feel loved and unworthy, that also makes you susceptible to abuse.
Yeah,
Right.
That's right.
So sometimes that's also can be a reason why I think these children can be victimized over and over again by different people.
Yes.
Is because they have that spirit about them of being a victim, of being unworthy, and that attracts perpetrators, I think, sometimes.
Well, let me say something. I think the best way parents can protect their children is to make sure those children know they're loved. See, I came from a very dysfunctional family, and I mean really dysfunctional. Alcoholic father, abusive mother, and I never felt loved as a child, ever. And see, we have this human need. God created us to be loved. If we don't get it there in some unconscious way, we'll reach out for it, and it makes us susceptible.
It does.
Yeah.
And I think it's important maybe to even mention here that sexual abuse doesn't just happen to children. It can happen, date rapes in a relationship where you actually are considering, you're wanting to be with a person, you're going along with it, and that can cause a lot of confusion. You like the relationship up to a certain point, but then a boundary is crossed. I guess when
Good.
And
Touch,
it can
you know,
actually-
touch feels good.
Right. And so I think that, and sexual abuse doesn't, only happen to children. That's what we concentrate on, but it can happen through the teenage and early college years.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's a good point to bring out, that it can happen really at any point.
Another
along the
thing
way.
that I found interesting in talking with survivors, women survivors, is that the way that I actually would define abuse can be totally different than the way they do. I've had a couple people tell me their stories, and in my mind, I've thought, that's abusive? But for them, it was. They are still affected by it. And so I think that we really can't do a measuring stick, that people, when they feel like a line, their personal boundary has been violated, that, like I know of one person who felt like her uncle wanted to play games when she was taking a bath as a little child, and she stopped it from going on, but she still has trouble with even seeing that uncle.
Yeah.
Just seeing him. And so for her, she has to deal with that, whatever it was that, maybe it was, the family trust issue. Maybe that's what she had to deal with.
You have 8 things that you can do if you know. Yours were related to male survivors of abuse, but I think it also could apply to females. And there are 8 things. And would you talk about each one of them briefly?
Sure.
The first one is to say, I'm sorry for what happened.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
what?
I'm sorry for what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that actually implies believing them.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times a child will come forward. I know several people like this, and they were not believed, or at least nobody took action to protect them. And so saying, I'm sorry that happened to you, and really meaning it, it validates that it was real.
Yeah, and that does happen.
Oh, I know too many stories of men who tried, even as boys, tried to tell the story and ignored, or you shouldn't make up stories like that, you know.
Yeah. Or how could you say that about your
Right.
Brother, your uncle.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, right.
And then also the whole issue of confidentiality. I promise that I won't tell anyone unless you give me permission. How important is that?
That is absolutely paramount. I think the biggest problem, I think women tend to be fixers. Some men do too. But they're not just tend to be fixers, but they also go to their social network, like 1 or 2 friends. And and for men to know that, if I ever thought my wife had told someone without my permission, it would have just torn me
Destroyed
apart.
you.
Yeah.
But I also knew my wife she didn't talk readily to people.
Right.
She didn't open up quite as, I'm much more open than she is about many things. And I knew she would never talk about it till I was ready to give her permission. And I think that's just so crucial. You have to trust that person that they will keep your secret until you're ready to launch out.
Yeah, and then you talk about empathizing with them, trying to feel their anguish. How do you do that with someone, especially if you yourself haven't been molested?
I'm not sure you really can empathize. I think you can care. You can see. Here's what my wife said, and I think I said this earlier. Is my wife said, "I don't understand this, but I love you and I'm here with you." And she listened, and it's the way she listened. I have a little thing somebody gave me and said, "Of course I'm listening. Can't you see me yawning?" See?
Right.
Well, yeah. Well, that's not the kind of listening I'm talking about. What I find, if I lock eyes with them, there's something intimate about eye to eye. If they're looking at me talking and I'm looking at them, they know I'm listening, or I know they're listening to me. And there's something powerful about that. But the people are going like this all the time, and or moving, or picking up the cell phone, or dusting, or something. They're not listening.
That doesn't work. And then,
I'm sorry.
Well,
No,
we're running short on
right.
time, so I'm going to run through
Okay.
these. Talks about don't focus on your feelings of anger, pain, or revulsion. You want to talk about that, Sis?
Well, I think that's important, allowing a person to express themselves without being so caught up in your own reaction that it becomes about you then, instead of about them. And C said, be a good listener.
Yeah, and don't react to yourself. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other one you talk about is you can't heal him, and you can't talk him out of it. Don't try to be the healer. I think.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm trying to see. It's what I call active listening. You don't give advice. You don't tell them what to do or how to correct. You just say,
That's good.
I hear you.
That's
Yeah.
good. It's really important to be heard.
Yeah.
And I say that you need to tell somebody. You must tell someone the details
You
of
can't-
that. You can write it out to the Lord, but you need to tell a trusted person, and I believe that's crucial. It's like emptying a big overflowing trash can from inside. Something about speaking it.
Here's the way I say it. I know of myself only what I say of myself. See, as long as it's in here, it's a secret. But if I tell you and you listen to me, you nod, now it's no longer a secret. Now you have freed me from this demonic power inside me.
Yeah.
Don't press for details.
Yeah.
Yeah, see, that's a form of abuse in itself.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
I have a friend who talked with a school counselor once, and he got so aggressive and wanting to know every detail that she shut down, and she just never
Yeah,
went
right.
back.
Yeah.
And he could have rescued her,
Right.
but he didn't handle it well.
And you suggest professional help, counseling.
Absolutely, it's
For some
sometimes
people, and I'm absolutely for counseling if they are ready and open.
If they're, and so in the meantime, being there, being that friend, and encouraging them if that's something that they want to do. Is there anything that you shouldn't say?
I know just exactly how you feel because you don't. Or when you start, see, if you start giving them advice or telling them how to fix it, you've already harmed them.
Right.
Active listening is the very, very best thing you can do. You don't take sides for anybody. You don't, press for any extra details. See, I'm just a strong believer in active listening.
Right. Listen, listen, listen. Okay. And you have written a book, Cecil, about when a man you love was abused.
And I have a new one coming out.
A new one, okay.
That'll be called Not Quite Healed. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay, well, and can you, again, just briefly, those two books, the difference between the two?
Well, the first one is really, the first half of the book, it's really like two books. The first half of the book is, here's what happened to us. And the second book is, okay, here's what you can do to help us. Listen, all those kinds of things. The new book we're coming out. See, I thought that after 2 or 3 years, I was through with it. But what I've realized is, despite all these years, I'm getting close, but I'm not quite healed. And let me just say one more thing. See, I think I now look back and I say, God used all that awful stuff to make me who I am today. The things I like about myself probably would not have come about if I hadn't been abused. I don't want to ever be abused. That's not what I'm.
But God somehow redeemed that.
He
redeemed that.
He is.
And Sue, you are also
I've just
got a book coming out.
Yes, I do. I
Yes.
just finished one. It's Hope, Healing, and Help for Survivors of Sexual Abuse, a faith-based journey, and it's an interactive book with a Bible study, and it's available online.
So this is something that if I had a friend who had gone through abuse, I could. That's
right.
one way I could support her.
That's right.
Possibly. Is
That's
that
right.
Yeah, I also have a blog.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's called
We'll put that up on
Men Shattering the Silence.blogspot.com. Men Shattering the Silence.blogspot.com. And
Excellent.
we only have like 35, 40 people who've actually signed up for it, but we're now getting well over 600 people
checking it out.
checking it out. And what I do is I write a few things, but very short. Try to encourage people, and we got a few women who tell their story too. And it's amazing how many of the women's stories just go right along with them. But really try, and I even have twice had perpetrators write and talk about their shame.
Yeah, and that is a whole nother
That's right.
side of the equation too. Very, very sad side of the equation, but there's help for them as well. But not on this show. We're not going to talk about that. Okay. So do you know someone who could benefit from this information? Tell them about the show. Send them the YouTube link if they're not able to watch the show at some point. It could be the beginning of the hope and healing that they never thought was possible. Catch us on the social media, and thank you so much for watching.